All right, so buckle up because today we're diving deep into Saw Forward, and we're doing this just for you. This wasn't just your average sequel, though. The source we're looking at actually calls it a turning point or even like a poison pill for the whole franchise. And you want to know why? Because right off the bat, they hit you with this bombshell. Jigsaw's dead.
Yeah.
Not like playing dead, not a gotcha moment later on.
Yeah.
Dead as a doornail.
Yeah.
Remember how you felt when you first saw that?
I mean, it was definitely a bold move to make. You can't deny that. And it really throws a wrench in the whole Saw formula, you know? Like, the source makes this point that it's a game changer, literally. How do you keep people on the edge of their seats, let alone interested when the puppet master is gone?
It's kind of like ripping the fangs out of a snake and still expecting it to bite you.
Right? Yeah, exactly. But instead of just letting go of Jigsaw entirely, the source points out that Saw Fee tries to have it both ways. On the one hand, you've got that autopsy scene, super graphic, setting the stage for a world without Jigsaw. But then, bam! A cassette tape appears.
Classic Jigsaw.
Total Jigsaw move.
So even in death, he's pulling the strings. It's a tough thing to pull off.
Yeah.
And the source even wonders if they managed to do it. I mean, on the one hand, having these layers of planning is classic Saw. But does it actually make him scarier? Or does it kind of ruin the suspense because he's basically a ghost controlling everything?
That's where things get really interesting because it all comes down to how the audience sees it. Are we supposed to be blown away by how smart Jigsaw is, or did the movie just lose its edge by making him seem untouchable? The source doesn't really give a straight answer, which I think is intentional.
And to try and fill that void, they throw Sergeant Rigg at us as the main character. But the source really goes after this decision. They call him one of the most boring leads in the entire franchise. Did you agree with them?
Yeah, I mean, the source makes some good points about Rigg. On the surface, he's your typical good guy, right? A cop putting it all on the line to save people. But the source argues that the movie kind of messes that up by making his whole test about learning to let go of control, which is kind of ironic when you think about it because he's the one forcing everyone else into these deadly games to teach them that lesson.
Yeah, it's a weird message for sure. And the source also says that this is a big part of why Rigg's character arc doesn't really work.
Yeah.
He's all over the place. His actions don't match up with the growth he's supposed to be going through. Do you think that's the main reason he doesn't really land as the main character?
I think it plays a huge role. The source makes this argument that without a strong character at the center of the story, the audience just feels lost. Especially in a franchise like Saw, where the emotional stakes are so high, you really need to connect with what the characters are going through to feel the tension.
And speaking of high stakes, we can't forget the thing that Saw is known for. The traps. Gotta admit, part of the fun for me is seeing how twisted they get. But even I had to wonder what they were thinking with some of the traps in Saw 4.
The source makes a good point. At what point does it stop being clever and just become too far-fetched? Yeah, they basically say that Saw 4 crosses the line from ingenious to ridiculous. It all comes down to suspension of disbelief, which the source argues the movie really pushes to its limits. You've got these crazy elaborate setups with complex machinery, and it starts to feel less like something a really messed up person could actually build and more like, well, a movie trying to outdo itself.
Especially when you remember that Jigsaw was supposedly running all of this from beyond the grave. The source specifically points to the sheer scale and planning involved as a major issue. It takes away from that grounded realism that made the earlier movies so effective.
Yeah, because if anything can happen, the stakes just don't feel as real. And that's a dangerous game to play when you're dealing with a horror franchise.
And as if we didn't have enough to keep track of already, we're also introduced to a bunch of new characters. Agents Strom and Perez from the FBI.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's Detective Hoffman.
Oh, yeah.
And the source does not hold back when it comes to criticizing how these new characters are handled.
Yeah.
Strom and Perez are basically seen as underdeveloped, almost like they were just thrown in as an afterthought.
Yeah.
And then there's Hoffman.
Here we go.
The source actually calls his big twist predictable and even says it's kind of eye-roll worthy. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I can definitely see where they're coming from. Bringing in new characters could have been a way to breathe new life into the franchise, but the source is basically saying that it just falls flat.
Right. And then to make things even more complicated, we've got the parallel timeline with Saw 3. Instead of adding to the story, the source argues that it just feels messy. Like they were more interested in shocking the audience than telling a story that makes sense.
It's a good example of what the source sees as Saw 4's biggest problem. Trying to do too much at once. You've got new characters, crazy traps, timelines jumping all over the place, and it's just a lot to handle. The source even questions whether all of it actually helps the story they're trying to tell.
Yeah, it's like they threw a bunch of stuff to the wall to see what would stick.
Yeah.
And speaking of things that don't stick, the source spends a lot of time talking about all the plot holes and loose ends in Saw 4 Did any of those really stand out to you?
Oh yeah, there are definitely a few that the source goes into detail about.
Yeah.
Like when they introduce a third Jigsaw apprentice, it feels like they were so busy trying to keep surprising the audience that they kind of forgot about their own rules.
Right. Like at some point, it stops being shocking and just becomes a mess. Like, seriously, how many secret apprentices did this guy have? It starts to get a little hard to believe.
Exactly. And the source says that this is a classic example of what happens when a franchise gets stretched too thin. Instead of letting the story unfold naturally, it feels like they're just trying to force connections that aren't really there.
And the most obvious example of that might be the backstory they give for Jill Jigsaw's wife. The source points out how her character feels really underdeveloped, almost like they only added her in later to try and explain some of the plot hole.
Yeah, it shows this real struggle that Saw 4 has, and maybe the whole franchise. How do you keep building on Jigsaw's legacy without it feeling forced? Or, as the source puts it, trying to put a puzzle together with the wrong pieces.
Which brings us to the source's final verdict on Saw 4, and they don't hold back. They say that this is where the franchise starts to go downhill, choosing gore and crazy plot twists over believable characters and real suspense. Did
No.
you agree with that?
I can definitely see where they're coming from. The source's biggest criticism is that Saw 4 loses sight of what made the original so good. The psychological thriller part of it, it gets too caught up in its own lore and ends up sacrificing tension for shock value.
So what about you? Did you actually enjoy Saw 4 despite all these problems? Or did those issues that the source points out totally ruin it for you?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it makes you think about horror franchises in general and how they deal with losing their main villain. Can you really recapture that same magic without the original mastermind? Or are all the sequels doomed to just be pale imitations stuck in the shadow of the original?
That's a pretty creepy thought to end on. It's definitely given me a lot to chew on as I go back and watch Saw 4 and the rest of the franchise. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been really eye-opening, to say the least.